The sun hung low, over the jagged red cliffs as Ethan, Calloway, guided his tired horse through the winding canyon. The rocks glowed like fire in the fading light, and a strange stillness had settled over the land. No birds sang. No insects hummed. Even the wind, which usually whispered through the narrow walls, seemed to hold its breath. Ethan had ridden this route countless times while checking on his cattle or following wandering tracks, but tonight every step his horse took echoed with a warning he couldn't quite understand. He slowed to a stop, listening. That's when he heard it, a deep, broken groan drifting through the brush. It wasn't the cry of any animal he knew. It carried pain, anger, and something hauntingly human. He dismounted, tying the reins loosely around a small boulder, and crept toward the sound. Pushing aside thorny branches and tangled weeds, he came upon a sight that froze him to the ground. A massive iron bear trap clamped viciously around the leg of an enormous Apache woman. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, powerful as a lioness. Her dark skin was marked faintly with tribal paint, and thick braids framed a face twisted in silent agony. Blood seeped from the crushed flesh beneath the metal jaws, staining the dust beneath her. Her eyes lifted and locked onto his, sharp and filled with fire. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Ethan knew that in any other moment, this encounter would have ended with a knife or an arrow buried in his body. He was a cowboy. She was Apache. Their people had fought for generations. But all he saw was a living being in terrible pain. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands to show he carried no weapon. His voice was low and steady as he spoke, though his heart pounded inside his chest. He approached step by step, never breaking her gaze. She tensed, muscles coiling as if she might strike, but she made no move. Kneeling beside her, Ethan pulled a metal bar from his saddlebag and forced it between the jaws of the trap. The steel resisted, biting deeper into her flesh. With a grunt of effort, he pried it open until at last the trap sprang loose. A raw cry escaped her lips, half pain, half relief. Blood poured freely now. Without hesitating, Ethan tore a strip from his own shirt and wrapped it tightly around her wounded leg, pressing down until the bleeding slowed. When he finished, he leaned back, giving her space. Slowly, she pushed herself upright. Though injured, she stood taller than him, towering and fierce. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. Then, in a gesture he had never expected, she lowered her head slightly in respect. Without a word, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the trees. Ethan stood alone in the quiet canyon, the torn fabric of his shirt fluttering in the breeze, unaware that this simple act of mercy had just set an unstoppable fate into motion. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Ethan was pulled from his sleep by a strange, heavy silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of morning on the ranch. It was weighted, tense, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He stepped onto the porch, squinting into the pale light, and his heart nearly stopped. His ranch was surrounded. Apache warriors stood in a wide circle, their horses calm, their weapons held but not raised. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply waited, still and watchful, like carved figures from the earth. At their center sat a tall, imposing man, his posture unbending, his presence commanding the very air around him. The chief. Beside him stood the woman from the canyon. She looked different now. Her wound was bound with fresh leaves and herbal paste. Her stance strong despite the injury. The early morning light caught the high planes of her face and the dark intensity of her eyes. She did not glare at him, nor did she smile. She simply watched, as if measuring him, weighing his worth. Ethan stepped down from the porch, hands open, making sure no one mistook his intentions. Every instinct told him to reach for his rifle. But something stronger, a sense of respect for the moment, kept him still. The chief raised one hand, and the faint movement silenced the very air. He spoke slowly, his voice calm but powerful. Yesterday my daughter was caught in the jaws of death. The trap did not belong to my people. It was set by careless hands meant for beasts. Ethan nodded once. I didn't know who she was. I only saw she was hurt. You saw more than that, the chief replied. Many men would have turned and ridden away. Others would have taken advantage of her weakness. You chose to kneel. You chose to help. There was no accusation in his words, only truth. In our way, the older man continued, A life saved creates a bond that cannot be ignored. My daughter walks today because your hands freed her. That debt is not measured in coins, cattle, or land. It is measured in blood and spirit. A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors. Then the chief's eyes hardened slightly. You will take her as your wife. The words fell like thunder. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Of all the things he had imagined, marriage had not been one of them. He looked at the woman again. She stared back at him, unreadable, her shoulders squared, silent but unbroken. I didn't save her for a reward, he said quietly. I don't own her, and I don't believe in forcing a woman into anything. A hint of approval flickered in the chief's eyes. That is exactly why you are worthy. He leaned forward. She is a warrior, a protector of our people. If she stands beside you, it is not as property, but as an equal. If you refuse, you dishonor the bond and declare yourself our enemy. The air tightened. Dozens of eyes fixed on Ethan, waiting. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them and nodded. Then I will honor your custom. Aye, oui. The days that followed the chief's declaration felt unreal, as if Ethan were moving through someone else's life instead of his own. The ranch that had once been a quiet, lonely stretch of land became a place filled with unfamiliar energy. Apache warriors came and went, bringing offerings of food, hides, and woven cloth for the ceremony that would bind two lives together. His ranch hands moved with cautious curiosity, whispering among themselves as they watched the preparations unfold. No one dared challenge the decision. The word of a chief was not a thing spoken lightly, and the presence of so many strong, silent warriors made that clear. Her name was Nayeli, and he learned it quietly from one of the women who came to tend her wounded leg. Though still bandaged, she walked with strength, refusing to show any sign of weakness. Ethan noticed the way she observed everything around her, the land, the animals, even the shifting clouds above the hills. She moved like someone who belonged to the earth in a way he had never seen before. At first, they spoke very little. When their eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding, built not on words, but on the moment in the canyon when life and death had hung in the balance. The day of the ceremony arrived under a wide blue sky. Drums echoed across the plains, deep and steady, carrying a rhythm that seemed older than the land itself. Apache elders formed a circle while Ethan stood at the center, dressed in his cleanest clothes, though they felt strange and stiff on his body. Nayeli approached slowly, her presence commanding silence. She wore traditional garments adorned with feathers and beads, symbols of her people and her strength. When she stood before him, there was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. The chief spoke of unity, of debts repaid through honor rather than violence. He spoke of peace, a word rarely heard on either side of the frontier. Then, without the exchange of rings or church vows, the bond was sealed. A simple touch of hands, a shared breath, a joining recognized by the spirits of the land. Life together did not suddenly become easy. There were long moments of silence, of learning each other's habits and boundaries. She was not used to walls closing her in at night, and he was not used to sharing his space with another soul. Yet in subtle ways, they began to meet in the middle. She showed him how to read broken twigs and disturbed dust to track even the lightest step. He showed her how to handle the rifle with control rather than raw force. Slowly, the land responded to their union. Raids ceased. Tension faded. Travelers found safety in the surrounding territory. And one evening, as they stood together watching the sun bleed gold over the horizon, Nayeli finally broke her silence. "The spirits do not make mistakes," she said softly. "They placed that trap in my path so that I would find you." Ethan looked at her, understanding at last that what had begun as a simple act of mercy had grown.